Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us for the fourth session of our series ABC of Marxism with Ian Spencer. Tonight we're looking at the really important issues of revolution, class, and party. And Ian assures me we're also looking at the subject of what is a sect, which should be interesting, and how we should organize, plus what do communists do when a revolution fails, as in the case of Marx and Engels. Really interesting subjects. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. Yes, this is a period which is, in a sense, one of the most graphic and fruitful of the life of Marx and Engels. Not least of which because they were thrown in really into a kind of leading position in a almost global revolution, well, certainly a European-wide revolution, a revolution which touched at least 50 countries. And so for those who are inclined to think that revolutions only happen on a country by country basis, it does provide an interesting insight into the idea of a global revolution, the idea of that a revolution could in fact happen almost simultaneously in a range of different countries. It concerns, of course, the revolutions of 1848. And what I'm again trying to do really is show how the understanding of the political economy of capitalism, the philosophy of Hegel, and their own particular perspective with regard to the future of the international proletariat, brings us to an understanding of the revolutions of 1848 and beyond. So also the other aspects of it are, for example, Marx and Engels weren't very fond of writing definitions. They just didn't tend to do it, not least of which because they tended to be quite static by their very nature. Again, this is a kind of a feature of the Hegelian influence on Marx and Engels. So for Marx and Engels, something like a class can only be really understood in its dynamic, as it were, just in the same way as we saw with the sale of labor power as a commodity which once utilized yields labor. You see there is an essential dynamic to it, and similarly with classes. So in other words, this is in stark contrast to a perspective around what a class is from a sociological point of view. As someone who had the dubious distinction of having to teach sociology in universities for a number of years, the typical thing that you used to have to be, where you were invited to trot out for students was, there are kind of three kind of founding fathers, as it were, of sociology: Marx, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And the typical kind of first year sociology essay is compare and contrast the concept of Marx, the concept of class in the works of Marx and Engels, and say Max Weber. And what you see in sociology, of course, is class is really a kind of descriptive category. It's a way not of how you earn your money, but so much as how you spend it. So it's related to famously Max Weber, the bourgeois sociologist, who had a hand in writing the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, talked about class in his famous essay, Class, Status and Party, where he talks about, yes, there is a relationship, for example, to the means of production, but also it's a question about one's status in society and the amount of political influence one has. So that's the party bit of class, status and party. Marx doesn't see it at all like that. And it's not a question of, and the typical thing that happens, particularly with first year undergraduate essays, is that, oh, Marx had these ideas about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Weber came along and added a level of sophistication. In fact, what you see in almost all bourgeois sociology is an attempt to obfuscate Marxism. It's said of Max Weber that he was engaged in a dialogue with the ghost of Marx. And the contemporaneous nature of sociology to Marx and Marxism is, of course, graphically illustrated by the fact that the early English sociologist Spencer, no relation to me, I can assure you, is buried directly across the path from Marx at Highgate Cemetery. Spencer, of course, was a vile specimen of sociology in that he was a kind of sort of white supremacist, as it were, and he was also the person who's credited with coining the term the survival of the fittest with regard to the works of Darwin. When in fact, of course, Darwin didn't use those terms at all until later. He talked about the evolution by selection. So sociology and Marx kind of grew up together, as it were. And one could argue that really sociology grows up as a justifying ideology for capitalism in opposition to Marx, and in opposition to Marx's understanding, for example, of both economic categories and of political ones. So if you think of Marx's labor theory of value, there is no doubt in Marx's mind whatsoever that the reason why things have value is because human beings are exploited. The commodity is not just a thing, it's a social relationship. For this laptop or a book or anything else to have value, it's because human labor is embodied in it. A little of which we talked about last time we met. And that is important because Marx, it was part of a long line of classical political economists who understood fully that it's the amount of labor embodied in commodities that gives them their value, and therefore implicitly and not too far from being explicitly, it is related to human exploitation. So classes for Marx are not defined in that way. And of course, the other thing that sociology students always used to bristle at was Marx's use of language. So both he and Engels were classically educated, so they were imbued with Greek and Latin terms. They had studied them from what we would regard as primary school. So when Marx talks about the proletariat, it is, as I mentioned, it would have been in ancient Rome, the class of landless laborers, and he's using that term to distinguish it from the petty bourgeoisie, for example, who are small property owners or a peasantry. Bourgeois is simply derived from, has the same root as burgess, so a city dweller or a town dweller. The idea of a free person who owns not only themselves but owns property and is in a position, for example, to have a shop or industry of one sort or another. So these are quite distinct from feudal estates. An estate, for example, in France before the Revolution would have included the clergy, who would have received their income as a result of tithes, taxes levied by the church on the peasantry. And of course, the same thing existed in Britain before the Reformation. And you still find it in vestiges in English place names, places called Tithe Barn Lane or some such. So that's quite a different source of income from a proletarian who has nothing else to sell but their labor power. So it's an objective relationship to the means of production. The picture, by the way, was originally a Russian revolutionary poster and was subsequently, as it were, translated into English and used by the industrial workers of the world. And as you see, this pyramid of the capitalist system. I don't know whether you can see my cursor dancing around here. You've got the proletariat under here. We work for all, we feed all. And here is the exploiting class. We eat for you. We shoot at you, the armed forces, as a kind of standing army, as it were. And we fool you in terms of the clergy. Again, this is not a reflection of Marx's attitude towards religion, but of course he does regard religion as not only the heart of a heartless world, but as an ideological form. And of course, above that, the ruling class proper. So it's not just some sort of community of interest. It's not just, it, so from a Marxist point of view, a general practitioner who goes to work and does their work as a wage worker is in the same class position as somebody who works in Amazon or Deliveroo or whatever. They're still got nothing else to sell but their labour power. Then some workers may well be more privileged than others, maybe because they've got a better union. Train drivers do quite well because they've got a good union. The BMA used to be a good union, but quite clearly has found itself undermined in recent years. So it's quite different as a notion of a class. And of course, but the other thing about it, of course, is that Marx had a very rich understanding about the multifarious gradations within, for example, the proletariat. Originally, Das Kapital was supposed to be 7 volumes, and volume 3 would have been devoted entirely to wage labor. The fact that that was never written meant that a lot of the sophistication which is in Marx's work is something you have to dig out by careful study over the years. So you see quite a lot of references in volume 3 of Capital to the more privileged sections of the working class, for example. But the other aspect of it about class and the dynamic within society is that it's the thing that defines the nature of the society as a mode of production is the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. In a feudal society, the extraction is direct by the direct threat of violence, and no qualms whatsoever about backing that up. And also it's decentralized, so you're answerable to your own lord. The serf is tied to the land. It is unfree labor, albeit not chattel slavery. I mean, there were periods in feudal England where there were chattel slaves, but nevertheless, for much of the period, it was a serfdom where whilst your person couldn't be arbitrarily destroyed, you could be punished at the Lord's behest, and you were tied to the land. You weren't free to simply leave and go and work for someone else. So it's a defining feature of the mode of production. There were various plans for Das Kapital, and the best kind of discussion of all of that is in Roman Rozdolsky's The Making of Marx's Capital. In the end, of course, it ended up being scaled back to 3 volumes, and of course, 2 of those were not finished. And what is sometimes referred to as volume 4 of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value, is really a discussion of the history of economic thought. So it's important to understand that about a class and why Marx didn't provide a definition. It wasn't just out of badness, and it wasn't just out of badness that he used his term like bourgeoisie and proletariat. It was out of precision, and it was because the idea of if you have a definition, by the nature of it, it's rather static, and of course there will always be innumerable exceptions anyway. But Marx, just even if you take the normal writings that were published, there are loads of references to different parts of the bourgeoisie. There's the petit bourgeoisie for a start. Marx talks about the lumpen proletariat, so the déclassé elements, reduced, for example, to criminal activity or prostitution or whatever else. He talks about the peasantry, and again, there's an understanding that there's a difference between a poor peasantry and a rich peasantry, and so therefore the understanding of class relations is quite the opposite of what the first year sociology student tends to trot out as that somehow Weber's work gives you a level of sophistication that isn't there in Marx. In fact, what Weber provides you with is a potentially infinite gradation of classes defined purely in subjective terms. And how many times have you heard, well, somehow if you have egg and chips for your tea, that's a kind of elite motif of being working class. Well, that's just nonsense from a Marxist point of view, and it also gives you no possibility whatsoever of doing anything with it as a social scientific category. So, so there's class. It's a bit of an outline of why class is not really defined in Marx, but is understandable with even a fairly cursory glance at something like the Communist Manifesto. When we think about what a party is, not least of which because the famous book, The Manifesto of the Communist Party, usually just shortened to Communist Manifesto, what's noticeable about it, of course, there was no such organization called the Communist Party at the time. There were a couple of organizations. There was the League of the Just, which Wilhelm Weitling was a leading figure in. Wilhelm Weitling, of course, was part of that earlier history of socialistic and communistic activity, which was largely based upon the notion of for a secret sect, an organization which, for example, you were part of you often went through an initiation ceremony. There was a kind of esoteric form of knowledge, often a kind of catechism, which constituted part of the membership of being part of that sect. And the League of the Just was like that. There was a kind of catechism that one had to learn, and a series of rules that were only really revealed to the membership of the League of the Just. And of course, it's understandable why it was like that at the time, because quite often they were operating under conditions of illegality. And often on the basis not of the idea of a class taking power and a class ultimately being both universal and the end of all classes, but a sect like the League of the Just, the idea is that an insurrection mounted by the League of the Just would provide the spark that would lead to the revolution. And there were numerous revolutionaries at the time, most famously Proudhon, but also Auguste Blanqui, that operated on that basis, on the basis of a secret group that would stage insurrection at the drop of a hat, or as soon as they could muster their forces together, and that would supposedly lead to the revolution. Marx and Engels were adamant that they had to move away from that. There was originally the intention for the Communist Manifesto was that it would take the form sort of a bit like a catechism, and there were early kind of a sort of rough drafts, but Marx and Engels decided that was absolutely no longer suitable. That belonged to the past, and the Communist Manifesto was written as a manifesto as we would understand it today. So why call it the Manifesto of the Communist Party? And I think that's important. Not least of which because, as we'll see, Marx understood that there were other organizations out there. And in the context, for example, of England, the Chartists were hugely important at the time. And of course, Engels had direct personal experience of the Chartist movement in England, being as he was a factory manager in Manchester. So the Communist League, which is an organization which effectively sponsored the Communist Manifesto, came into being really out of a fusion of the League of the Just and the Communist Correspondence Committee, which is a small group of people in Germany, Belgium, France. And as the name suggests, corresponded with one another around areas of mutual interest about bringing a communist society. And in 1847, they became the Communist League. The interesting thing about the Manifesto of the Communist Party is it doesn't even mention the Communist League. So an important thing to remember as well is that we're reading it in English. And for anybody who's interested in taking a scholarship of the Communist Manifesto a little further, this is absolutely invaluable. It's by Hal Draper, The Adventures of the Communist Manifesto. And in it, Hal Draper has, among other things, provided a new translation for the Communist Manifesto. Because I might think, well, it's been going a while. hang on, what's wrong with the 1888 English edition, which, after all, Engels had a hand in supervising, as it were. But as Hal Draper points out, there are areas where the translation isn't necessarily as good as it could be. So, for example, in something where normally the term in the 1888 English edition, it says communists do not organize as separate organizations from other working class parties. That isn't apparently a very good translation, and Hal Draper has provided a helpful replacement in the form that the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis other workers' parties. They have no interests separate from the interests of a whole proletariat. And that brings us also to the heart of what a sect is. Not only is it an organization which has a kind of esoteric knowledge which it keeps secret from often its own membership. How many people have been members of parties like that, which have effectively announced changes in the party line without any kind of consultation or discussion? Which is a classic kind of sect behavior. But also, supposedly, sometimes this was done because they were afraid of being infiltrated by the police. In fact, it just meant that their own membership was kept uninformed, not to mention the class. And the other aspect of being a sect from that point of view is when the interests of the organization are put above that of the class itself. Don't see any of that in the works of Marx and Engels. It's not accidental that in the inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association in 1864, Marx says clearly, the liberation of the working classes is the act of the workers themselves. And here we are. The communists are not a special party vis-a-vis other workers' parties. They have no interests separate from the interests of the whole proletariat. Of course, these are organizations which Marx himself was directly involved in: Communist Correspondence Committee, the Communist League, and the International Working Men's Association, all of which, of course, were also subject to splits of one sort or another. But we'll leave that aside for a moment. And it's also worth remembering that, along with not giving a definition of a party, not giving a definition of a class, Marx doesn't either present a blueprint for what communism is. This nice little picture, The Golden Age by Lucas Cranach the Elder in 1530. I don't mean to imply that communism means going back to an earlier stage here, as it were, in the Garden of Eden. But instead, the Communist Manifesto is full of criticisms of organizations that want to turn the wheel of time back, as it were, to a period of individual commodity production by artisans, for example, and in particular, in that case, the object of his criticism was Proudhon. So, what if you and the outline really of what a communist society it would be is actually there, staring you in the face in the Communist Manifesto. The proletariat becomes the ruling class, at least in the early period, because ultimately the proletariat as ruling class will be the end of all classes. It is the abolition of all class society. So it's the abolition of private property. And not personal possessions. I mean, what Marx is at pains to point out in the Communist Manifesto is it's capitalism that does away with workers' access to personal possessions or the means of his subsistence. It's you have nothing else to sell but your labor power. The only thing that you really own is yourself, which you can enter into a wage contract, wage slavery, effectively, because you don't have a choice not to sell your labor power. But of course, it's not slavery. And this is one of the obfuscating things about it. This is one of the things that mystifies the whole labor contract, is the fact that you apparently sell your labor power to whomsoever you please. So it's the end of the wages system, not a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. The end of the wages system, which inherently means the transformation of family relations. They become truly human relations for the first time in history. Women are no longer dependent upon men as a breadwinner or turned into a kind of prostitution through the institution of marriage, or prostitution literally working the streets to sell their one marketable commodity. So you would see a complete transformation of family relations. Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto talk about the need for universal free education for all children, uh, rather than children being the property of their parents. So all production would be to meet human need. There would be the end of a standing armed forces in favour of a workers' militia, direct participative democracy, and above all, the end of the nation state. Repeatedly, Marx and Engels say the proletarian has no country. As in Hal Draper's translation, has no fatherland. And so all workers in that sense are part of that one great country, the international proletariat. So it's often said that Marx didn't give a blueprint for what communism is, but there are lots of examples where Marx is talking very much about an outline of what a socialist society would be like, socialism and communism being used interchangeably. So the manifesto of the Communist Party starts off famously with the line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." And what Marx is getting at is that the bourgeoisie already knows it could lose everything. It already knows it has brought into being the one class that could supplant them. And therefore, it's not accidental that Marx starts off his discussion in the Manifesto of the Communist Party with an analysis of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat as classes. Incidentally, quite apart from anything else, as you read it, it's an utterly beautiful piece of literature. And this is often what's overlooked. When people say they find it difficult to understand because of the language, of course, it's a little bit different to what you're used to in common parlance. But so Shakespeare, so's Dickens. But there isn't a wasted word, and it's beautifully crafted, and should be read. And anyone who's kind of embarking upon reading the Communist Manifesto for the first time, I would advocate just reading it like a novel. Just read it in the bath or something. It's not very long after all, and just let the words flow over you, and if necessary, read it aloud. It's a very good way of reading any text that you find a little bit difficult, is to read the thing aloud, almost to declaim it like a poem. So bourgeois and proletarians and communists, and this is important because Marx would have had in mind a whole range of different political organizations that existed at the time. And we see this, for example, the position of the communists on the various opposition parties. And therefore, on the one hand, he's saying, we don't form a special party vis-a-vis other working class parties. But on the other hand, the whole purpose of this manifesto is to bring some enlightenment to a series of organizations which are still, for example, dependent upon having an idea of socialism which is about going back to an earlier time of simple commodity production, or of the necessity to have a catechism and a kind of semi-religious form in order to make that appeal to the working class. Far from it. So what Marx is also saying is that, hang on, the purpose of this manifesto is to bring a little enlightenment to these organizations, because of themselves, all they're really coming up with is things like the need for insurrection. And as Marx and Engels repeatedly argued, you don't just play with insurrection, because the consequences of doing so are catastrophic. Not only can as we'll see when we look at the Paris Commune, the consequences of insurrection not only mean the death of many good militants, but it also means provocation of even more repression, which can set back the workers' movement for decades. And of course, that's exactly what happened in the revolutions of 1848. And then, of course, the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto is something I first read it when I was 12, so it's not that difficult. The communists disdain to conceal their views and intentions. They openly declare that their aims can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of every existing social order. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. In it, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Proletarians of all countries unite. And later on, as we'll see, there were attempts as the social democratic parties of Europe became mass parties to try and water down this idea that aims can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of every existing social order. And that somehow Marx and Engels, because they were also prepared to embrace electoral politics, somehow watered down their own commitment to revolutionary politics. At the grave of Karl Marx in 1883, Engels was adamant that Marx remained a revolutionist to his grave, and Engels remained a revolutionist to his grave. So let's have a little look at the revolutions of 1848, because here we are, an example of an international revolution. Now, most of these revolutions, and of course, we come back to, as we did in an earlier session, what is a revolution? The nature of these revolutions was far more in the form of a transition from feudalism to capitalism than from capitalism into socialism. But, and it's very important, is that Marx and Engels would have supported that transition. They did not support it because it wasn't a transition to socialism directly. And they also recognized, in the context of these revolutions, you often had alliances between different social classes. So again, we see the sophistication of Marx and Engels' understanding of the relationships between classes. So in the context of the revolutions in France, which overthrew the monarchy of Louis Philippe, leading to the Second French Republic, here portrayed the barricade en Rue Soufflon by Horace Vernet in 1848. So you can get an alliance, as it were, between the petit bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And then you'll see a shifting alliance later on when, for example, some of the gains which the bourgeoisie are seeking, such as the inviolability of property, a constituent assembly, a representative democracy, and so on. Once these have been gained, the tendency then is to row back on the revolution. And those people who had provided the militancy and who had shed the most blood, often the proletariat or the sans-culottes in the Great French Revolution, these are the people who were then betrayed and ultimately sacrificed. So the revolutions of 1848 started off in January with the wish to get rid of, in Sicily in particular, the Bourbon monarchy, and the revolutions touched over 50 countries in one form or another. And there was no coordinating force. There was no international party coordinating these events. Although, fortuitously, the Communist Manifesto was published in the February of 1848. And contrary to the idea that somehow the Communist Manifesto played no part or kind of rose without trace and only became really famous later on, in fact, the first print run of the Communist Manifesto, Marx would have expected it to be, 1,000 copies. It had to go to at least 3 print runs within a matter of months, and a second edition later on. So most of the revolutions of 1848 were concerned with the overthrow of absolutist monarchies or the development of parliamentary type democracy. Many of them were rooted in nationalist movements. So, for example, freedom within Italy from the Bourbon monarchy. And of course, later, although many of the gains that were made in the revolutions of 1848 were subsequently lost in counter-revolution between 1849 and 51, they also form the basis of what happened subsequently. So, for example, the unification of Italy under the active leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a member of the International Working Men's Association, although not a Marxist. So these were often coalitions of different classes, and although many were bloodily suppressed, many of the significant reforms that they won continue to exert an important influence. And it was a valuable school for Marx and Engels, and indeed the proletariat as a whole. So what happens when communists lose? What happens when you've lost the revolution and you're sent off with your tail between your legs? I mean, Marx had to get out of Belgium, settled briefly in Paris before then making his way to London, as did effectively the headquarters of the Communist League. Marx and Engels, again, were resisting calls by people like August Willich, himself a redoubtable revolutionary, and Karl Schapper, for an insurrection. They were arguing that the revolution's only just failed. What about another attempt? And this is precisely the sort of thing that Marx and Engels resisted. Engels, it has to be remembered, fought in at least 2 battles and was the aide-de-camp to August Willich, and was the last of August Willich's Freikorps to escape into Switzerland. And for at one point, there was grave concern about Engels being killed. But the Communist League ultimately, in settling in London, eventually split and was disbanded by 1852, not least of which because what happens when revolutions are defeated, of course, you get the backlash. And the Cologne Communist trial in 1852 effectively smashed the workers' movement in Germany for some considerable time afterwards. And so this was a time then for reflection and study and finding out where you went wrong and being honest in your appraisal of that. And so you see that in the output that Marx produced at the time. Class Struggles in France, a series of articles published in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung from over the period from 1848 to 1850 that were subsequently brought together as a little booklet by Engels and published in that form. And a lot of people ask me, well, where do you start when you're reading Marx and Engels? I would say, well, you could do a lot worse than start with the Communist Manifesto. And then while you're at it, have a go at Class Struggles in France. Have a go at the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. After Louis Philippe had been deposed, the last of the sort of Bourbon monarchs, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the great Napoleon Bonaparte, was eventually elected president in 1851, before then subsequently usurping the monarchy for himself. And the 18th Brumaire is a reference to the point when Napoleon Bonaparte, the first, usurped the monarchy for himself in revolutionary France. Marx also, this was the picture you'll see is the reading room of the British Museum. It's still there and still beautiful, and I recommend anyone to go and visit it. And not only did Marx work there, but later on, so did Lenin. Marx also wrote and published a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in 1859. What was Engels up to? Wasn't exactly letting the grass grow under his feet either. By 1850, he was written and published The Peasant War in Germany. He looked at the period of the Reformation in Germany and drew the analogy about the way in which in the peasant war in Germany, one class would ally itself with another, only then to sell out, as it were, the poor, the most radical revolutionary elements. Because they didn't want the revolution to go any further. So Engels, as I say, had served as ADC to Willich. Willich was so incensed that Marx wouldn't support the idea of another revolution or another insurrection. He challenged Marx to a duel, which Marx very sensibly declined. And later, Willich went off and served and actually rose to the rank of Major General in the US Union Army fighting in the Civil War. Engels eventually escaped via Switzerland and Genoa, I believe, and ended up in London in November 1849, and then eventually to take up the post that he held until he retired, which is effectively as manager of the family factory of Ehrman and Engels in Manchester. In this time, Engels supported Marx financially. That is well known. He also wrote copious journalism, and much of it is excellent and just really readable and fascinating. And again, often rooted in military matters. So if you want to read a really good history of the rifle, Engels is your man to go to. He also wrote for the Chartist magazine and engaged politically in workers' movements. The idea that these people were just sat in the library or whatever is so far from the truth as to be just frankly laughable. Marx, as you know, lived in London, and throughout much of that time, this was ironically one of the most creative periods of his life, but also one of the most tragic. At least 4 of his children died, all of whom, well, I don't know about the last one, but at least 3 of them probably in part as a result of the poverty that they suffered. Marx also supported himself with journalism. He didn't just sponge off Engels. He used to write articles for the New American Encyclopedia and other articles. Interestingly, Engels wrote some of the articles for him on the basis of Marx doing the research in the British Library. And they would be published in Marx's name so that he got the money for it. And if you've ever wondered about Marx's boils, there's loads of correspondence about his carbuncles and his boils and his furnicles, and it seems life has been absolutely miserable for him with these, especially as they all tended to be in pretty nasty places, like on his back of his thighs or on his arse or somewhere. There is a sort of post-mortem diagnosis by a dermatologist at the University of Newcastle, and it is suggested that what he had was hydrodentitis suppurativa, yeah, suppurating hydrodentitis. Anyway, so if you ever wonder, why you can't do things, just consider what these people were doing under the circumstances in which they were working, and still produced collected works running to 50 volumes. In 1856, the Marxists moved to Grafton Terrace, which is near Hampstead Hill, because Mrs. Marx, Jenny von Westphalen, received a legacy upon the death of her mother. And of course, Marx and Engels founded the International Working Men's Association in 1864. This is also a period in which, this is the most intense writing of the work that would eventually become Volume 1 of Capital. A quick dip into the Grundrisse, the preparatory writings for Capital. Among the things that you will find there is that, and in the correspondence between Marx and Engels, Marx at one point says that what he found very helpful in preparing Volume 1 of Capital was to go back and reread Hegel's Science of Logic, I have only the lesser logic. I've never read the whole logic. And it's a huge 2-volume set, I believe. But there was Marx, in preparation for his economic studies, was going back to read The Science of Logic by Hegel, an illustration, if ever there was one needed, that the dialectics was inseparable from his political and economic endeavors. So he also wrote, of course, on the slavery crisis in the USA, the US Civil War, and ultimately finding and publishing Capital in 1867. It's worth having a walk around sometimes, the places where Marx and Engels lived. When I was in London, I used to do it. Engels, when he eventually retired from his position at Ehrman and Engels, settled near Primrose Hill, which wasn't very far from my old school, Quinton Kynaston, on the Finchley Road. And it's a good walk. It's a nice place to go and visit. And of course, there are lots of pictures of them. Well, a famous picture or two of them, of Engels and the Marx family having their picnic on Parliament Hill in Hampstead Heath. So, comrades, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, comrade. If anybody's got a question or would like to make a contribution, please click raise hand and I'll bring you in just to get the ball rolling. As always, a few questions and a short discussion between us, if you don't mind. So Marx and Engels not being keen on definitions is, of course, for us a bit of a pain and can lead to misdefinitions and problems, but it does, of course, show their attitude to understanding that things are constantly in flux, aren't they? That things are born and they have to die, and capitalism has been born in order to die, hopefully of the working classes' hand. Communism too will have to, is present within capitalism, but it also will have to be renewed constantly if it's not to be dying and replaced with something else, higher forms of communism, ideally. In terms of the not there being a definition of class, because there is one really, it puts the two big classes against each other, and that is very helpful. I also liked your idea. It's an objective relationship, isn't it? It's not your idea. It is an objective relationship to the means of production. Engels, of course, that you mentioned at length as well, had a very particular relationship to the means of production. He bloody owned them. He was a capitalist, but he could become a member of the working class through subjectively, or how would you describe if we win over, we need to win over as many classes as possible, aren't we? I mean, so there are the two big classes, and then there are lots of classes in between. Some fluctuate. Some people in the bourgeoisie can be won over to the working class. The army has to be split. How do you see this? The relationship between the classes in between and people like Engels.
Yeah, I mean, without Engels, could Marx have done even half of it? And it wasn't just because Engels used to routinely put his fingers in the till and pilfer the petty cash of Ehrman and Engels in order to send Marx not only money but occasional crates of wine, because Marx, contrary to popular belief, actually enjoyed himself. On the one hand, the objective relationship to the means of production is that Friedrich Engels was a capitalist. He was bourgeois. His subjective relationship was firmly on the side of the proletariat. And again, it's these categories. Whereas sociology would just put, he was bourgeois, and of course you get that all the time. People talking about, well, Marx wasn't a worker; he never had a job in his life. In fact, he did apply for one job. He did apply for a job as a booking office clerk at St Pancras Station, but he didn't get it because of his fearsome countenance, his big shaggy beard and hair, and the fact that his handwriting was illegible meant he didn't get the job as a booking. The doctor of
Not the
philosophy,
boils on his bum then.
and not to mention the balls in his ass, and just as well he didn't get it. So, neither of them were horny-handed sons of toil, and I think there's something very important in that. It is the fact that an understanding of the situation that we find ourselves as workers doesn't just, I mean, any worker knows they're being exploited. Any worker knows that going to work is crap. Any worker knows that they're in a state of alienation insofar as, you don't feel that you are yourself when you are at work, and so on. But to really understand it requires some effort, to uncover the essence of what's at stake here. When Marx and Engels were thoroughgoing essentialists. The aim of science was to uncover the essence of the thing, and without Engels' help, both financially but also as a scholar, and what's often overlooked is that Engels himself was an outstanding scholar. Most of his later works that are known under his own name, things like The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, were of course written after Marx's death. But almost everything that he wrote subsequently, like that, had been the subject of innumerable debates with Marx and discussion around questions of anthropology, about the importance of original communism, proto-communism or communismus, which helped to subsequently. So anyone who, as I've seen in some kind of fairly silly discussions around, that there was a sort of a difference between Marx and Engels. The only difference really was that Engels was very much the popularizer. He had a good style when it came to writing stuff that was very accessible. So Engels' subjective experience was very firmly on the side of the proletariat, very firmly, one might argue, firmly part of the proletariat, in the sense that he lived his life as a revolutionary, even though he kept a horse and a very well-stocked wine cellar. And similarly with Marx, I mean, he both of these people, and Jenny von Westphalen and Eleanor Marx and Jenny Marx, gave their lives effectively for a struggle for the emancipation of all humanity, and that, how many people can say as much?
I mean, it's interesting, of course, if you go to work, and at that time it was like 10, 12 hours a day, are you going to then afterwards sit down and work out, where is this exploitation? I mean, it does disable us, doesn't it? It does disable the working class, that it has to go to work and live like that. And it's bloody exhausted. So, it is understandable that oftentimes you have to have people who are part of the working class, but perhaps are not active workers. That doesn't mean they are not worthy, etc. Another interesting thing about the, I mean, you mentioned I did actually study socialism in Frankfurt of all places, where Marx, he was listed as one of the three, but he was surpassed by Max Weber, and then they've developed them further, and he had he had his issues, and then the wonderful Frankfurt school came along and fucked it all up basically, but not that they are telling you that, but it is of course an attempt to reduce class to how you spend your money, not earn it. I think that was a really good way of putting it. Then also on the question of definition of the future, that's also an interesting one, isn't it? There's no blueprint for socialism, but yet in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, Marx and Engels make a big thing about explaining why not. They attack all those who have all these elaborate plans, be it, the rich, we still see that the rich have to give their money and do it for the working class. We have to just take that money and redistribute it a bit more. Or I don't think Marx and Engels actually mentioned him. Bakunin is another classic. 100 people shall run Europe. And who could decide who those 100 people are? Maybe Bakunin could decide that. That's his version of socialism. And you have all sorts of people making all kinds of templates, and how would socialism work? How would communism work? And Marx and Engels were pretty much the only ones who understood, well, we can't say because we don't know. Things will change. Things constantly change. Things might be entirely different by the time people fight for communism. Or have a revolution. But a question on that, then you said, they were very critical on turning back the wheel of time, and I agree. But they also took inspiration from what went before, didn't they? When especially Engels, looking at what has also been slightly badly translated into primitive communism, but was actually called by Marx and Engels Urkommunismus, a original communism, which is a much better way of putting it. And Engels in particular did a lot of work on looking back. I mean, his resources were sort of limited, so there's bits that are not quite right anymore, but that's understandable. But the big idea that in the past, people lived entirely different. There's nothing natural about capitalism. There's nothing natural about hierarchies like that. There's nothing natural about people being, some at the top and some being totally worn out and having nothing, while some people have everything. And this could be done away with. So they took inspiration from the past. Surely, if they didn't want to turn back the wheel of time, they took inspiration, didn't they?
Indeed, and in the Peasant War in Germany, which is really one of my favorite things written by Engels, in studying the life of Thomas Müntzer and comparing him with Martin Luther, it's really rather like if you read the history of the English Revolution and read about the levelers and in particular the diggers and Gerard Winstanley, for example. What they have in common is here are ideas before their time. Here are revolutionary ideas being put forward before their time. Thomas Müntzer is effectively arguing against not only the church but property relations, and that is why, for all his supposed piety, Martin Luther supports the crushing of the peasant war in Germany, the crushing of the peasant uprising, and it was that these, on the one hand, the revolutionary ideas being put forward by the poorest in society, but until you get to a point where there is a class which can actually realize that, then that is what makes them utopian. That is what makes them impossible. And so one could admire the valor of Gerard Winstanley or Thomas Müntzer, but they were ahead of their time. And of course, you could, if you wanted to, play around with that idea and say, well, the Russian Revolution was premature, or the uprising in Ireland in 1916, and so on. In order to win that worldwide revolution, there needs to be a class which can bring it into being, and that class is only the proletariat, because the peasantry cannot do it. They cannot achieve that kind of level of solidarity. They cannot achieve that kind of level of coordination. And Marx and Engels talk in glowing terms about Babeuf and Danton in the Great French Revolution, and they even had an admiration for the courage of Auguste Blanqui. I mean, a person who was an insurrectionist par excellence. I'll just mention one other little thing, by the way, about the Cologne anti-communist trials, and the fact that after the revolutions of 1848, Marx and Engels were subject to all sorts of calumny on the part of people who tried to associate them, first of all, as somehow being the cause of the revolutions of 1848, which of course couldn't possibly have been true. And one of the few books that Marx wrote and published in his lifetime was Herr Vogt, which was a refutation of so many of these kind of lies that were spread about. And Vogt himself was shown to be a kind of agent of the state. Published in 1816. It's quite a chunky volume as well, and I could have to confess I haven't read it. I've dipped into it to look for bits and pieces, but I haven't been able to forge through it. That'll be my summer project, perhaps. But always the critique of the Gotha program is often cited as the place where you've got a blueprint, because Marx talks about a communist society being a place where you can hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and criticize after dinner and that kind of thing. He also talked at one point about a stage on the way to abolishing money would be labour certificates, and this sort of quaint, old-fashioned idea that you take your labour certificate because you've done 10 hours of necessary labour in the course of a week, and then you can go and draw what you need from the warehouse. Well, things have moved on a bit. We're moving to an almost cashless economy, and this is a good example about something which is developing within capitalism, which will ultimately facilitate the transition to socialism, peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must. And if you already have a society where it's all on an electric card or your phone or some such, how much easier is that than a labour certificate? The conditions are already there. The abundance is already there. There's almost superabundance to the extent that we actually spend more destroying things than we do in producing stuff. I mean, capitalism is immensely wasteful. So the basis for social, in a sense, the world is rotten ripe for revolution.
Absolutely. Let's have a quick look then on how we're doing it. And you touched on that when, the party building question, which is, of course, vital, and it remains a vital question for us today, looking around, and, there's dozens of new organizations springing up, but none of them really, sorry, the Communist Party, worthy the name. Sorry. And you said when the Communist Manifesto was written, I'm sorry, frog in my throat. There was, of course, no Communist Party, quite right. The Communist League, the Communist League commissioned them to write it. But I think Engels writes in one of the forewords that there was a Communist Party in formation, isn't it? That's how he described it. There were moves towards building a Communist Party, and that was the Communist Manifesto was towards aiding that. And I was going to show that what we've that mistranslation you've mentioned, because I've got a little clip from that from a previous session, and I think that is quite important. That mistranslation, that from the 1888 translation, which Engels oversaw, and for various reasons. So this is the version that most people have in their Communist Manifesto. The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Now, I've been told many times, especially in the period of the Corbyn years, that this clearly means that Marx and Engels were arguing against setting up a communist party. Yes, it might be called the Manifesto of the Communist Party, but there was no communist party then, and that means that Marx and Engels were actually against communists forming a communist party on a communist basis, which is, of course, pretty weird reading the rest of the manifesto, which is all about how they are different from proletariat. And Hal Draper's book that Ian referenced, the Adventures of the Communist Manifesto, makes a really good job, not just dealing with this particular slightly bad translation, but also other parts, and explains where they come from. And he offers this translation that Ian mentioned. The communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties, but they are a party, but they're not special, in the sense that they don't put forward a different agenda. But they are, they do form a party ideally, and the communists at that time were in the process of formation, as I think Engels put it. And now on that, and the question of what's the difference between a party and a sect. You offered a couple of definitions, and it's also useful. The most famous one is this, that you. The groups, put the interests of the group above that of the working class as a whole, which I always find a bit I mean, would any group say, oh yeah, our group's putting the interests of our group above that of the working class? I mean, nobody thinks that's what they're doing, and it is a bit of a fluffy definition. Your other definition I liked, is a bit more we can't put it. It's a bit more realistic, or it's a bit more you can grab it. It's making sharp turns, for example, and announcing those turns to the membership rather than having the membership decide those things. So for 10 years you say A, and then suddenly the organization says B. I mean, I do the most recent example that springs to mind is a socialist appeal, which I do follow with some interest because it's quite entertaining, which is now the Revolutionary Communist Party, and they announced that at a conference. So the members at that conference had never heard about this, and they're being told we're now that we've been kicked out of the Labour Party, we're now becoming a communist party, and we're bringing out a newspaper called The Communist. And that's what's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it, like it or leave it. A few people didn't like it and had left the organization. But that seems to be a classic definition of a sect rather than a party. Can you talk a bit more about that, how you see that difference and how we can go about it today, and how they try to avoid it as well, the sect issue?
Well, in 1848, the term party didn't mean what it does today. It didn't mean everybody who was a member of a particular organisation. It meant, I mean, what you could talk about, the Liberal Party, not necessarily meaning that all those with a party card, but those who, for example, were in favour of a whole range of things, including, I don't know, self-government in Ireland, free trade, and so on, that were associated with liberalism. And similarly, I mean, you go back even earlier, you talk about the party of King George III and the party of the Prince Regent. It was those who shared the particular values, or those who shared those aims, and so on. I mean, the party that they would have had in one of the parties they would have had in mind, of course, were the Chartists themselves, and Engels was trying to influence them very directly by writing for their paper, and of course, 1848, there wasn't the revolution in Britain that there was in France and Germany and the Netherlands and so on, but there was a huge upswell, a movement and it's estimated that something like over 100,000 people were present at a Chartist demonstration in London at Kennington, roughly where the Imperial War Museum is today. And so it was a vast movement, and one which had inspired Engels in particular because of his direct relationship with it. But of course, he could see that these organizations were only really concerned with reforms within the context of a capitalist system. And from that point of view, what's important is that the communists act on that to move beyond that. And they do so because what they bring is not just a bad attitude or a bit of gumption, but what they bring is also a scientific approach to the situation. I mean, I don't mean to attack the Socialist Appeal or the Revolutionary Communist Party, whatever they were. I know some of them in Durham, and they're committed socialists, and I don't have any problem with them on a personal level. But for example, they've effectively declared that we're in a pre-revolutionary situation. The revolution is a matter of a few years away, and that therefore they have to grow the party. And we've seen it all before. Now, if we are in a pre-revolutionary situation, good, but I really don't see what the empirical evidence for that is, and you have to be a bit careful about it. And I think that's why Marx and Engels were always very hostile to the sectionalism of people like Weitling or Willich or whoever else, who were always ready to sort of declare the revolution is just around the corner, and all we now need is one more push. What we need to know is chuck a few bombs about. No, the consequences of that are disastrous, as they were in Germany in particular after 1848. Marx didn't take out all that time to write Herr Vogt just because he was a bit peeved at his personal treatment. It was because he needed to be able to demonstrate conclusively over and over again um, that we're not engaged in conspiratorial politics. It's a serious political movement and about the transformation of society.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, we've got only one person with a hand up. If anybody else wants to come in, make a contribution or ask questions, we're all friends here, so you can ask questions. Don't feel you can't. First one is Paul, and I think he's got an issue with his camera, so we'll only hear from him. Hi, Paul.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Okay, lovely. I'm just thinking about what Tina said about what is communism and the need for communism to constantly renew itself. And I was drawing from that back to something Ian said about like socialism and the communist revolution would enable people to be fully human for the first time. And I would take slight issue with that in the sense that, the history of humanity is one where we've lived, there's been times where on a primitive basis we've thrived as a species and we've lived under like forms of egalitarianism. I know you can romanticize that, but it's kind of, as well as an epoch, communism is a tendency to human behavior. And given that, and when people talked about things flowing and changing, in terms of the party form, we're all in favor of the party, democratic centralism, and all the rest of it. But I think we fetishize sometimes, what the perfect form of a communist party would be, and how is it going to be in the future? A mass communist party with high tech and everything, and we're sort of in some sense stuck with some of these notions of what a party should be, whether that's, I don't know, 1917 or social democracy or what have you. And I think we can get like stuck in the part. Same in terms of like identifications of class. That's something that's very fluid, and I think some people on the left can be almost glamorize people being hard up and stuff, and see class in a very rigid way. I think. Anyway, thank you. Great talk.
Thanks, Paul. Ian, do you want to reply?
Yeah, on that last point, I'm certainly not disagreeing with you. I mean, there has been a tendency on the part of some groups, they shall remain nameless, of somehow you're not really a worker if, for example, you're not creating surplus value. So what does that mean? If you're a nurse working in a private care home, you're a proletarian. If you're a nurse working in the NHS, employed against taxation, you're not. Well, that's nonsense, of course. And that was no part really of what Marx was arguing for. And moreover, notions around middle class jobs can't somehow be proletarian. I mean, people working as architects may work under very nice conditions under but in the end, if they're not working, they're not earning. There are differences. I mean, they may well be partners in their architectural firm or whatever, but as we've seen with Engels himself, that doesn't mean that he's out an architect or someone is somehow outside of capitalist relations of production. The form taken by the party, again, is rather like the form taken by a revolution or whatever else. It's not something you can easily predict. The Soviets were not predicted by Lenin beforehand. In fact, one of the striking things, really, if you read Trotsky's 1905, which is one of his finest books, in my opinion, is that Trotsky understood the nature of the Soviets before Lenin did, and because he was there, in the Petrograd Soviet, and saw the importance of this as a new form, and new forms will be thrown up again. And the whole point about theory is to prepare ourselves, Revolution, I would argue, is inevitable. The outcome, however, isn't. And whether we end up being put back for another 100 years or so many of us get slaughtered, we end up in some utterly barbarous place, then it is why we do theory, and why, incidentally, the anarchists don't do theory. We can't rely all the time on spontaneity. Spontaneity has a sort of a nice appeal to it, and if you look at the revolutions of 1848, there was lots of spontaneity and lots of defeat. And one can look at lots of situations where there's been spontaneous uprisings, but easily dissipated, easily destroyed, easily subject to. And what's important about a party as opposed to, a groundswell of opinion or some such, is that it can weather the storm. If necessary, go underground. If necessary, organize in some other way. In necessary, and that's effectively what the German Social Democratic Party did after the revolution. Well, as it came into being later on. And of course, I'm not in talking about Urkommunismus, proto-communism. It's very important to understand that because it's not any part of what it is to be essentially human. But Marx and Engels did have a conception of human nature, and that shouldn't be overlooked. The idea that there's no such thing as human nature, only human nature in any specific epoch, was, ironically enough, a leitmotif of Stalinism. It was Althusser, really, that was arguing that there's no such thing as human nature, and that somehow we can leave all that Hegelian stuff to one side. Marx most graphically talks about it in Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, but he also makes reference to human nature in Capital. So the idea that there was an epistemological break, and that's all just part of some sort of Hegelian flummery, it could be left in the past. Human nature is actually vital, because what Marx was on about was the creation of a truly human society, because he's arguing that humanity's species being is to work upon nature precisely when we're free from the need to just simply feed ourselves or put a roof over our heads or whatever. I mean, he talks, as you know, in the manuscripts of, bees make hives and so on, but they do so on an instinctual basis. Only we do it in advance, in our minds beforehand. We plan what we're going to do, and then we go on ahead and work upon nature when we're free from need. So, if you were free and you didn't have to work at all, I wouldn't just end up sitting about. I mean, I am semi-retired and I don't just sit about. I'm busier now than when I was working. And labour, in Marxist terms, becomes man's prime want.
Yeah, I like that idea that we probably don't know what the revolution will bring and which formations will rise up. So anything that exists now will probably be swept away. Every organization of the left and will be replaced by something that's more adequate to the task at hand. The key, I think, isn't that what we're doing with our various series, is that we learn what happened before, that we learn from history, we learn the mistakes that were made, be it 100, 200 years ago, but also more recently, be it with the Corbyn years, what happened there? How was that defeated? I think there's a tendency to sort of just, let's move on, let's be nice to each other and try to build something like Corbynism, but outside the Labour Party with the same program, and hope that'll go better than it did in the Corbyn years and when he was the Labour leader, which seems slightly unlikely. I'd leave it at that. But I think we have to learn from our mistakes in the past and learn lessons. Carl wants to ask a question or make a contribution. Also promise with the camera so we can hear him. Hi.
Hi, Tina. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, brilliant. Firstly, thanks for that presentation, Ian. It was very interesting. I don't know if you could make the slides available to comrades that are in the talk, because I think many of us would find them quite useful just to go back over and maybe use ourselves. But what I wanted to speak to specifically is the second part of the talk in the descriptions of the party. And there's a definition that I always fall back to, and I think it stands the test of time. I just wanted to get your opinions on whether you agree with that, whether it's an adequate definition, and how it stops rising above the working class in that sort of bureaucratic caste, like you were just starting to allude to there. But in his preference to what I think is his best work, The History of the Revolution, Trotsky said that only on the basis of a study of political processes in the masses themselves can we understand the role of parties and leaders. Now, as Tina was saying, there's a plethora of parties, but it's the concentrating within the masses. Forget what a party's calling itself, how many members they seem to have. Engels, as you said, was the son of a capitalist, but it was the embedding himself within the working class so that he can dialectically and honestly analyse concrete situations, such as epochs of advancement or decline in the working class, the consciousness of the working class, and therefore the actual composition of the existing and developing parties. And Trotsky continues more in relation to individuals, I think. He says they constitute not an independent, but nevertheless a very important element in the process. Now, we know, I think you'd agree that Marxism doesn't deny the importance of the individual, be it Marx, Engels, or even people of the other side, if you like, Churchill, Hitler. The famous one I always go back to when trying to make this point is Franz Ferdinand. Everybody knows who he was, an important individual, assassinated, and that started the war. But I always pose the question, if that assassin had missed, would the war still have happened? Of course it would, because of the circumstances, the concrete circumstances of that time. So I know what Ian was saying about people thinking ahead of their time, but is that not just revolutionary thought that challenges the status quo? But as I say, the role and importance of an individual is only as important as that historical epoch and the developing processes of the time, be that philosophies, the development of the productive forces, technologies, science. Anyway, the ending to Trotsky's quote, which I think is the best definition of a party that I've ever come across. He says, without a guiding organisation, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam not enclosed in a piston box. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, but the steam. And I think what that talks to is whether we want to agree that we're in a pre-revolutionary period or a period of decline, there is anger that exists in society. We saw a number of strikes and protests growing last year, carrying on now. And all that fight and that energy just seems to me to disappear into thin air. It's not harnessed and focused, because there's no power like the working class in movement. The famous sayings of not a light shines or a wheel turns without the kind permission of the working class. So when that's mobilized, it's one of the greatest forces on earth. And it tells me everything I think I need to know about building cadres that are capable of leading the movement so they can become them individuals within this epoch of moving that revolutionary movement forward, raising the intellectual level of the masses, which I hope talks like this will do, and the whole series that you've got planned in, and embedding themselves within the masses, and the need for a communist party to act as that piston box in shaping and moving the power of the working class in the right direction. Otherwise, we see, as we saw with a great number of the revolutions you alluded to, the victory of the counter-revolutionary movements as that power sort of dissipates into thin air, as the analogy that Trotsky used. So I just wondered if Ian agrees with that definition of the party and how sectarianism plays into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
I agree with you entirely. Nothing I'll disagree with you there. What I've found over the years, and I don't know whether it's part of your experience as well, is where, for example, valuable cadres, completely honest, completely sincere in their wish to change society, end up becoming foot soldiers and newspaper sellers to build the party as an object in itself. And from that point of view, what I've tended to see is those same people denied the opportunity to play any kind of active role within the thinking in that party. where they do become newspaper fodder, really newspaper selling fodder. And such organisations which don't have any kind of democratic basis, there isn't really any kind of discussion. There's no tolerance of sects, no toleration of factions within the party, because all parties have factions. A lot of parties have tended to ban factions because they think that leads to splits. I would argue that without factions, you will get splits, because what happens is that people will find it utterly stifling and end up just leaving, or they form another little group, and without learning the lessons. And whilst I agree with you, and the history of the Russian Revolution by Trotsky is a magnificent book. I mean, both as a piece of literature and as a history. But it's also noticeable that many of the people who call themselves Trotskyists don't seem to use Marx's method from that point of view. They don't. There is a hostility to democracy, and that's one of the problems. And Trotsky himself, of course, in things like terrorism and communism, showed a very unhealthy authoritarian streak. As the Kronstadt the sailors of the Kronstadt uprising would attest, and therein is the problem. A lot of what we have to go on is sometimes magnificent literature written at a time when the Russian Revolution was itself already defeated, and where you put that defeat is open to question. Factions were banned by the Bolsheviks, 1921? Not as a sign of strength, but arguably as a sign of weakness. So how do you stop a Stalin if you don't have some kind of democracy within that party? Now, of course, we're talking about the Russian Empire in which the proletariat itself had been decimated. And from that point of view, the social force that could have potentially saved Russia from turning into an absolute monstrosity wasn't there. But nevertheless, I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, certainly in terms of, there's lots of examples of people being made by revolutions. And the example Trotsky gave us of Father Gepon, of course. And of course, we're right now in the middle of a completely extraordinary situation. The nature of Zionism, the nature of British and US complicity in Israeli genocide is there in front of our very eyes. And on Saturday, I'll be off to London again, along with hundreds of thousands of people, and walk through the streets. And where will it eventually go? I would like to think that at the very least we are in the position. One of my earliest political memories is of celebrating the second anniversary of the defeat of US imperialism in Vietnam. And the Vietnam War exerted a powerful influence on the way people thought about the world, and I think had a part in making me a communist. I'd like to think that if anything positive comes out of the genocide in Palestine, it will be a transformation in people's consciousness. What's then needed is the kind of organizational forms that can turn that into a movement which can withstand repression that we're already starting to see happen, among other things.
Absolutely. What's missing there is a party, isn't it, that does something with the hundreds of thousands of people and doesn't just, they go back home and then there's nowhere to channel that properly. Seems to be bits of it starting to change in the US, perhaps, but they have, of course, a very difficult political system, which makes the sort of organization of communists even more difficult. Okay, we've got one more person who wants to ask a question or come in. Julian, I'm just making you into a panelist. If you could accept that, and then I can switch your if you could switch on your camera and your microphone.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was just a throwaway remark by Ian, but I don't regard I don't think we should regard, and I don't think it's a Marxist analysis to regard American and British and other imperialism in the Middle East as being complicit in what Israel is doing. I think it probably would be even better to think of Israel as a kind of armed wing of imperialism in the Middle East that's responsible for doing all the atrocities which no doubt Americans and the American Zionists, who outnumber the Israeli Zionists by many times, by the way, I believe, the American Christian Zionists. I've no doubt they'd love to be doing the job themselves, but they're quite happy for the Israelis to do the job for them in the Middle East as some kind of proxies. But I mean, to call UK and US imperialism complicit in what's happening rather than being the agents of what's happening, I think would be completely, well, just a mistake and not a proper Marxist analysis or any kind of political analysis of the situation at the moment. But I forgive him because I'm sure it would be, perhaps it was a bit of a throwaway remark.
Also slightly off topic, but we do have a bit of time, so we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit of a throwaway remark. I mean, Britain is the originator of the perfidy. I mean, we've had a very fruitful series of sessions on Palestine, and of course, Britain's role in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, and the actual creation of, in the words of Sir Ronald Storrs, the former governor of Jerusalem, a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a potentially hostile sea of Arabism, is something that should be read by everyone. I mean, the best account of it, I believe, is Nathan Weinstock, Zionism, False Messiah, and if read in conjunction with Ilan Pape's work, the ethnic cleansing of Israel, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, is, I would thought, obligatory reading. It's horrifying. I mean, just to take a few little things. I mean, the very development of the Haganah was in part under the training of one Major Ord Wingate, who was a British Christian Zionist and British soldier serving in Palestine at the time, effectively training the Haganah to how to wipe out Palestinian population. And Ord Wingate subsequently, of course, went on to become Major General Ord Wingate before he was mercifully killed in a plane crash. And there again, Glubb Pasha. Glubb Pasha played a huge role, again, a British Army officer who effectively became the officer commanding of the King of Jordan's army, and played that perfidious role of the King of Jordan, effectively saying, well, we don't really care about the Palestinians, but we'd like to keep the West Bank of the Jordan. So, so Jordan, originally called Transjordan, included both sides, and Gleb Pasha was part of that whole game, and so the disgusting nature of British imperialism is right at the heart of it. The fact that it's now part of the American empire is, of course, well known to everyone.
But while we're talking about this, it's not like Israel just does what the US want, isn't it? It's not that way around either. So it is there's no puppet masters in that sense. There's a reason why Israel came into being, but there's more going on than Joe Biden just telling Netanyahu what to do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but it is part of course, the internal logic of Zionism. I don't know at what point the United States might ever turn around and say, actually, now, Israel, you're more of a liability. And if they did and then pull the plug, well, then it's conceivable that we could see an end to Zionism. However, that doesn't look even remotely on the cards at the moment. I mean, just in the same way that, for example, you know, I remember long periods in which nobody really gave a toss about apartheid South Africa. But what made a difference there was that the Soviet Union was no longer prepared to support Umkhonto we Sizwe. The South African Communist Party, under the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union, effectively decided that they would play a part in helping to make South Africa a safe place to make profits in. And from that point of view, President Reagan really didn't give a toss whether it was the ANC in power or anyone else. In fact, what we can see is the ANC played the role of marshalling the black working class behind the interests of capital. So what we do know from dialectics, of course, is that nothing remains the same and that things will move. And the contradictions in the Israeli system are just as glaring as in apartheid South Africa, and just as transient. That doesn't mean to say we can shrug our shoulders and just wait for it to collapse. It's only going to collapse with human agency ultimately, but collapse it will.
Absolutely. Do you want to any final words to sum up this session? What are the key themes, the key ideas we should take away from it?
Firstly, the interconnectedness between the political, economic, and philosophical thoughts of Marx and Engels, as always, which is what I've tried to do throughout the series, is try and show how they're interconnected. Moreover, that they learned from those experiences and built it into their understanding of the next situation. Now, Marx and Engels were not soothsayers. They didn't read crystal balls. They embarked upon a science of history, and a science of history because they were familiar with Hegel's understanding of history. And therefore, I think that is something to take forward. The groups or whatever, I mean, for example, I mean, I welcome Socialist Appeal's decision to form themselves as the Revolutionary Communist Party, but if they're not to just go the same way as the SWP and all these other groups, and are just simply wasting a load of cadres, then they need to learn those lessons as well.
Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent session. Next week, we're back to the Communist Culture Club, and we're looking at a related issue, which is a sort of May Day special. We're going to have with us two guests from the Radical Anthropology group, Chris Knight and Camilla Power, and they'll be talking about communism of the past and communism of the future. How does the Urkommunismus, the primitive communism, how it affects also our thinking and that of Marx and Engels going forward to a communist future. Thanks very much, Ian. If anybody would like to present something at a future session of the Communist Culture Club, or even a new series, because we have 8 sessions planned for this series, and then we'll do something else, get in touch, make some suggestions, but ideally propose something that you could also see through. Don't just say, oh, so somebody could do A, B, and C. We need comrades to volunteer to actually see something through. So thank you very much, comrades. See you next week. Bye-bye.